This didn't happen to me, but I know the story well enough that I might as well have been there. My parents have told it enough times over the years that every detail, every smell, every inch of that remote northern campsite has been etched into my mind like it's one of my own memories. It's one of those stories that starts off simple but lingers with you, the kind of thing that makes you rethink what alone in the wilderness really means. Back in the late summer of 1986, before I was born, my parents, Mark and Linda, were deep in northern Manitoba, way past any sort of road or regular access. They were in their early 30s at the time, both fit and experienced in backcountry canoeing. My dad had grown up fishing the rivers and lakes across the prairie provinces, and my mom had learned to love the outdoors after meeting him. They'd done several long trips together before, but this one was longer and more remote than any of the others. It was their version of a honeymoon. Even though they'd been married for 3 years already, they had driven 8 hours north from Winnipeg, then taken a float plane into a drop-off point near Clearwater Lake. From there, it was just the two of them, a Kevlar canoe, a month's worth of dehydrated meals, a topographic map, a compass, and a plan to paddle a big loop through a series of rivers and lakes that almost nobody outside of bush pilots and Cree trappers had probably seen. By the time the story took place, they were nearly 2 weeks in. My mom kept a little journal, and from what she wrote, they were roughly 120 kilometers into the wilderness, having passed through 2 portages the previous day and making camp on a narrow, uneven strip of land beside a deep creek that connected 2 lakes, Little River and Grayson Lake. The campsite itself wasn't ideal. They had picked it mostly because the sun was going down, and the next portage was several kilometers of tough bushwhacking upstream. The ground sloped unevenly toward the water, and the tent was squeezed into a patch between some thick chokecherry bushes and the gnarled roots of an old birch tree. It was the only flat space around, and even that was stretching the definition of flat. That night, everything seemed normal. They'd eaten a small dinner of freeze-dried chili and bannock cooked on a small camp stove. They filtered water from the creek, hung the food barrel from a tree about 20 yards from the tent, and crawled into their down sleeping bags just after sunset. There was no fire, too dry that week, and no room to safely build one. They zipped the tent shut and fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the occasional slap of a fish jumping in the lake. Then came the morning. It was early, around 5:30 a.m., maybe earlier. The sky was starting to lighten, that soft gray-blue light that comes right before the sun rises. My parents were both still groggy, half asleep in that dazed, dreamlike state when you're not fully aware of where you are yet. The air was cool. Condensation clung to the inside of the tent fly. The ground was cold beneath the foam sleeping pads. My mom said later she remembered thinking about oatmeal, trying to convince herself to get up and boil water. My dad was lying on his side, facing the back of the tent, the part that was nearest to the bushes behind them. And then they heard it. First, it was just a rustling, not loud, just the soft shift of leaves brushing together, like a squirrel or bird. But then it kept going. Heavy movement, slow and deliberate, the kind of sound that doesn't belong to a squirrel or even a raccoon. The bushes shook, more than they should have, and the noise got closer until it was right behind the tent. My dad sat up, still wrapped in his sleeping bag. The sound was maybe 2 feet from his head now, just beyond the thin nylon wall. My mom was still lying down, facing the other way. Neither of them said anything. They were still trying to understand what was going on. The noise had gone from curious to downright alarming. Then, without warning, the back half of the tent collapsed. 1 second, my dad was upright, trying to blink himself awake. The next, he was flat on his back, buried under canvas, poles, and the full weight of something heavy pressing down from outside. The whole rear corner of the tent had caved in with a loud, snapping crumple. The support pole on that side had cracked in half. At first, my dad thought a tree branch had fallen. Maybe the old birch had shed a limb. But the weight wasn't sharp or sudden. It didn't crush, just pressed. Firm and oddly warm. He could feel it through the fabric. His mind hadn't caught up yet, and then suddenly it lifted. Just like that, the pressure was gone. The side of the tent flopped back up, sagging from the broken pole but no longer smothering him. They scrambled out. Zippers jerked open. My mom pulled her coat on half inside out. My dad grabbed the hatchet they kept near the door, though he admitted later he had no idea what he was going to do with it. About 10 feet away, just past the bushes, a black bear stood staring at them. It wasn't a huge one, maybe a subadult about 200 pounds. Still big enough to do serious damage if it wanted to. It looked confused, almost embarrassed, as if it had stumbled into the wrong place by accident. Its fur was wet with dew, and bits of plant matter stuck to its haunches. It blinked slowly, ears perked up but not pinned. My parents froze. The bear didn't move at first, just stared. Then, after a few long seconds, it turned and wandered off into the trees, trotting at a steady pace until it disappeared completely into the brush. They didn't chase it. They didn't try to follow. They just stood there in the cold morning light, trying to figure out what had just happened. After a few minutes, they surveyed the damage. The back half of the tent was crushed. One of the aluminum poles had bent into a useless curve, and several of the stakes had been ripped out of the ground. A wide dent ran along the nylon where the bear had leaned or maybe sat. It wasn't clear if the bear had stumbled, tripped, or just lowered itself by accident onto the tent, but the evidence was undeniable. Something very large had come far too close for comfort. Behind the tent, the chokecherry bushes were half-flattened. Bear tracks, wide, padded prints, were visible in the mud. Some of the berries had been stripped from the branches. A few green droppings were found nearby, half-digested chokecherries and grass. It looked like the bear had been foraging quietly, maybe standing to reach higher branches, and had lost its balance. The tent, while damaged, was still usable. My dad spent an hour trying to bend the pole back into shape with a rock. They used duct tape and a tent peg to brace it. The rest of the gear was untouched. The bear hadn't gone near the food barrel or their packs. They didn't stick around. By 8 a.m., they had packed up everything and were back in the canoe, heading upstream toward Grayson Lake. They paddled for several hours, more alert than ever, hearts still pounding from the morning's adrenaline. Every branch snap from the forest made them jump. They didn't stop to eat until they'd put at least 5 kilometers between themselves and that site. That night, they camped on a rocky bluff beside the water, far from any bushes or overhanging trees. The tent was anchored to the stone with weighted bags and wrapped tight. They didn't sleep much. The woods were alive with sounds, most of them harmless, but every one of them suspicious after what had happened. The rest of the trip went smoothly. No more wildlife encounters, no more collapsed tents. They completed their loop 3 weeks later and radioed the float plane for pickup at a prearranged rendezvous point. By the time they flew back to the launch station and drove south toward home, the story had already become something they couldn't wait to tell. To this day, my dad can truthfully say he's been sat on by a bear. It didn't maul him, didn't swipe or bite or charge. It just sort of sat, probably by mistake. But that's the kind of thing you don't forget. It's a reminder of just how close the wild really is when you leave the road behind. You think you're prepared, that you're the one out there observing nature. But sometimes nature turns around and stares back. Even now, they still go on trips. Less remote ones, maybe, and with better tents. My dad always double-checks where they pitch, and he never sets up too close to a berry bush again. The story gets a laugh at family dinners. People always think he's joking when he says he woke up to a bear sitting on him. But he's not. He can point to the scar on the tent. Still has it stored in the basement. A big dent in the fabric, stitched and patched, but never fully smoothed out. A quiet reminder that sometimes, in the early hours of a cold northern morning, a bear might just decide your tent looks like a good place to lean. And if you're lucky, that's all it does. I was 33 when I decided to take a break from everything. It was late September 2017, and things were starting to weigh me down in ways I hadn't really admitted to anyone. I worked long hours in a warehouse on the south side of Des Moines, and the night shifts had worn me thin. I wasn't sleeping well. I was getting these headaches that started around my temples and wouldn't let up until I was half blind from the pain. I wasn't seeing anyone. My phone barely rang, and I'd spend whole weekends sitting in a dark apartment pretending I was resting. I knew I needed to change something before I broke down completely. A guy I used to work with, Mark, told me about a cabin he stayed in once near the edge of Chippewa National Forest in northern Minnesota. He said it was quiet, remote, no neighbors, nothing around but trees and water. That sounded like exactly what I needed. I found it listed online. A small wooden place with a screened porch, wood-burning stove, and a small dock stretching out into a still lake. It was about a 4-hour drive north of Grand Rapids. I booked it for 12 days. I left early on a Monday, packed up my old Ford Focus with canned food, dry snacks, a few gallons of water, a folding knife, a flare gun, and a small generator. I brought a fishing rod, even though I didn't really know how to fish, and a stack of books I kept meaning to read. The weather was just starting to shift into fall, and the air smelled cleaner the farther north I drove. There weren't many cars once I passed Deer River, and the roads turned to gravel not long after that. I didn't see another person for the last 20 minutes of the drive. The last turn was marked by a rusty sign half swallowed by weeds. The tires crunched over broken twigs and uneven ground as I pulled in. The cabin looked exactly like the photos, maybe smaller in person, but solid. Weather-worn boards, a steep roof, 2 front steps leading to a sagging door. There was an old shed nearby, half covered in ivy. The lake stretched out behind the place, surrounded by trees that reflected off the water like glass. I didn't see or hear anything out of place. It felt like I'd driven off the edge of the world. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and a little like mice, but it was clean enough. A cot by the wall, an old armchair, a stone fireplace, and a tiny kitchen area with a sink that didn't work. The generator had enough fuel for a couple of hours each night if I used it right. I unpacked slowly, took my time organizing the shelves, checked the windows to make sure they latched. I found a dead spider curled behind the nightstand and tossed it out the front door. The first few days were uneventful. I woke up with the sun, made simple breakfasts, and sat on the dock watching the fog roll off the water. I walked the narrow trails around the property, collected fallen branches to use in the fireplace, and took naps when I felt tired. I wrote in a small notebook, mostly just fragments of thoughts and sketches of trees. No one knew exactly where I was. I told my sister I was going to be up north for a while, but I didn't give her the exact address. I didn't want to be reached. I was on my 5th night when things started to feel off. I woke up around 3 in the morning. I don't remember what pulled me out of sleep. Maybe a sound, maybe a dream, but I was suddenly wide awake, and the room was freezing. The fire had died down to embers, and I could see my breath. I got up to throw a few logs in, and as I did, I glanced out the front window. The moon was low and bright, and I could clearly see the trail that led from the road to the cabin. And right there, just at the edge where the trees started, I saw something strange. It wasn't a person, I didn't think it was, but there was a dark shape just standing there. It didn't move. I stood frozen with one hand on the wood stove handle, staring at it. It wasn't tall, maybe the height of a big dog, but too wide, too upright. I waited, thinking maybe it was a stump or a trick of the light. I stood there for over a minute, and then I blinked, and it was gone. I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I went outside to check. The ground was soft with dew and leaves, but I didn't see any tracks. I walked the trail back toward the road slowly, looking for anything out of place. Nothing. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I tried to shake it off, but over the next few nights, more things started happening. One morning, I woke up and found the porch screen hanging loose from one side. The nails looked like they'd been pulled, not rusted out. I fixed it with a rock and a thick stick since I didn't have tools. The night after that, I heard something knock against the back wall of the cabin. Not an animal scratch, a solid thud. Just once, but loud enough to wake me. I started sleeping with the knife in my hand. I kept the generator off to avoid the noise. I spent more time inside. I stopped walking the trails. On the 9th night, I heard what I thought was someone moving outside around 2 in the morning. It was slow, careful steps on the dried leaves. I turned off my flashlight and crouched by the window. There was nothing visible, but I could hear the sound of something walking. It circled the cabin once. I heard the soft crunch of it stepping near the shed, then near the dock, then just under the front window. Then it stopped. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The steps didn't come back. I stayed like that for an hour. At sunrise, I went outside. There were no prints, no signs of disturbance, nothing to prove what I'd heard. But I knew I'd heard it. I didn't imagine that. It wasn't a deer. It walked in a circle around the place and stopped directly under the front window. That day, I started packing. I had 3 nights left on my stay, but something in me snapped. I didn't care about the money anymore. I loaded up everything I could and kept the rest near the door. I kept the knife in my coat pocket and didn't let my back face the windows. I planned to leave first thing in the morning. I didn't want to drive in the dark. I thought maybe whoever or whatever it was might be less bold in daylight. That last night, I barely slept. I kept my coat and boots on. I kept the flashlight in my lap and the generator off. Around midnight, I heard movement again. This time, it was slower. I knew the rhythm now. It wasn't an animal's curiosity. It was deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to get in. They were just making their presence known. At around 2 in the morning, I heard something new. A scraping sound from behind the cabin. Not metal, not wood, more like something heavy being dragged across rock. It went on for nearly 5 minutes, then silence. I waited until first light. I threw the rest of my things into the trunk and didn't even check the back of the cabin. I just left. I drove fast down the gravel road and didn't stop until I hit pavement again. Once I got home, I didn't talk about what happened, not even to Mark. I didn't report anything. What would I say? That someone wandered the woods around my cabin and didn't actually do anything? That I saw a shape standing on a trail one night and heard footsteps outside? Took a long time to feel comfortable sleeping again. I moved apartments. I got a dog. I didn't take another solo trip after that. About 8 months later, I saw something on the local news. A brief story about a missing hiker found dead near Chippewa National Forest. They didn't give details, just said the man had gone off-grid and was discovered after months of searching. The photo they showed of the area was taken from a helicopter. I recognized the trees. I recognized the lake. It was maybe half a mile from that cabin. They never said how he died, just that he had succumbed to the elements. I knew better. The woods up there weren't empty. Someone was living out there. Someone who didn't want to be found, and who didn't want anyone else there either. I never went back. I've never even driven north since, and I'm glad I left when I did. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed just one more night. It was October of 2018 when I decided to spend a long weekend alone at a cabin I had rented deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 36 years old then, working a job that drained every bit of energy I had during the week. The city had become loud in ways I hadn't noticed before. People were always rushing, and the sound of traffic and construction had started to feel like nails on a chalkboard. I needed silence. I needed to be alone somewhere quiet, somewhere far from everything. So, when I found this small listing online for a secluded cabin near a place called Alder Creek, it felt like a perfect idea. No neighbors for miles, no cell service, no internet. It was exactly what I wanted. The drive up took me nearly 6 hours. The last part of it was nothing but dirt road that twisted through thick trees. Leaves had turned deep red and orange, and they fell constantly onto the road like confetti. I kept the windows up because the cold air cut sharp even during the day. I remember thinking how peaceful it all looked. Sunlight pushing through branches, no other cars in sight, not even a mailbox. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, it was already late afternoon. The place was smaller than I imagined, but clean and sturdy, with siding, tin roof, a stone chimney. There was a little shed about 20 feet off to the side, half hidden behind trees, and a narrow path that led down toward the sound of running water. Inside, the cabin was simple. A twin bed, a small wooden table, a chair, and a cast iron stove. No power, but there were a few lanterns hanging on hooks, a pile of chopped wood, and a hand pump for water at the sink. I had brought enough supplies to last me through the weekend. Canned food, a camp stove, flashlight, spare batteries, matches, and a first aid kit. I wasn't trying to rough it, but I wanted quiet, and this place had it. After unpacking and settling in, I lit a lantern, cracked open a beer, and just sat on the steps outside, listening to nothing but trees rustling and the occasional snap of twigs from animals I couldn't see. That first night passed quietly. I slept well, bundled in layers with the fire keeping the room just warm enough. In the morning, I made instant coffee and walked around the property. The path led to a small creek with cold, clear water. I sat on a rock and watched it move around fallen branches. There was no sign of other people anywhere, not even trash or boot prints. It was one of the few times in my adult life I felt truly alone in a good way. Later that day, I decided to check out the shed. It had an old padlock, but the key had been left on a hook inside the cabin. The door creaked loudly when I pulled it open. Inside were the usual tools: an axe, handsaw, some rusty garden tools, a gas can, and what looked like a stack of old wooden crates pushed against the back wall. Nothing unusual. The air smelled like old wood and gasoline. I didn't spend long in there. That evening, I made a small fire outside and sat under the stars. There were so many stars. Without city lights, they looked like they were doubled in number. I ate a cold can of beans and sat quietly, watching the fire until it burned down. I felt content. That was probably the last moment I truly felt that way. It started with sounds, very faint at first. On the second night, as I was lying in bed, I heard what I thought was a branch snapping outside. Nothing unusual in the woods, so I ignored it. But then I heard it again. Not just a snap, but a deliberate crunch, like someone stepping on leaves. I sat up, turned off the lantern, and listened. For a while, it was completely quiet. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it sounded too heavy, too slow for an animal. I waited maybe 20 minutes, heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. Then it stopped. Whatever it was, I didn't hear it again that night. The next day, I tried to brush it off. Animals live in the woods. That's their home, not mine. I spent the day chopping some wood, exploring a bit further up the creek, and reading a book I'd brought. But I kept looking over my shoulder more than before. That night, I made sure everything was locked up tight. I checked the shed, closed the latch on the cabin door, and even wedged a chair under the knob. I lay in bed fully clothed with my flashlight on the pillow beside me. And again, I heard it, this time closer. Definitely footsteps, slow and spaced out, circling the cabin. I didn't move, just listened. They would stop for a long time, then start again like whoever or whatever it was standing still, waiting. At one point, they got so close I could hear leaves being pushed aside, almost like someone brushing against the wall of the cabin itself. I didn't sleep at all that night. When daylight came, I stepped outside cautiously, holding the axe I'd taken from the shed. There were faint marks in the ground, flattened patches of leaves, a few scuffed spots in the dirt, but nothing clear enough to say for sure what it was. Could have been my own tracks. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, then out toward the trees. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling that I was being watched had burrowed deep into my skin. I considered leaving that day. I had enough gas in the car, and my nerves were fried. But some dumb, stubborn part of me didn't want to feel like I had been chased away by nothing. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe it really was an animal and I was letting my imagination run wild. So I stayed, but I didn't relax. I kept the axe with me, stayed close to the cabin, and hardly touched the food I'd brought. Everything felt wrong. That night, I barely kept the fire going. I was too focused on the woods, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees over and over. I thought maybe I could scare off whatever it was just by showing I was alert. But just after midnight, something happened that pushed everything too far. There was a sound behind the shed, a solid thump, not a twig or a footstep. Something hit the side of it. I ran toward it without thinking, shining the light on the wall. Nothing. Then I swung the beam around and caught a figure in the corner of the light, just a flash of a person, half hidden behind the trees. It was so quick, I almost convinced myself I hadn't seen it. But the shape was clear, upright, human-sized, moving fast. I yelled, even though I knew it was pointless. There was no answer, and they were gone. I didn't go back inside the cabin. I locked the door. Sure, but I sat on the floor with my back to the wall, axe in my hands, flashlight off. I didn't want to give away my position. Every sound from the woods sounded like footsteps now. Every breeze that moved the trees made my muscles tense. It was a long, endless night, and when the sun finally came up, I was shaking from exhaustion and cold. I decided to leave immediately. I packed everything in less than 10 minutes, dumped what I didn't need in the trash barrel behind the cabin, and jumped in the car. But as I drove back down the dirt road, something made me stop. About a quarter mile from the cabin, I spotted something odd on the side of the road. A piece of red fabric, torn and tangled in a branch. I got out, heart pounding, and found that it was part of a flannel shirt, just hanging there, like someone brushed past it in a hurry. Not mine. I looked around, but there was no one. I got back in the car and didn't stop until I hit the main road hours later. Back in the city, everything felt loud again, but now it was a kind of comfort. I was surrounded by people, by noise, by light. I kept thinking about what I'd seen, the footsteps, the figure, the shirt. I hadn't imagined all of it. Someone had been out there, maybe watching me, maybe waiting for me to fall asleep, maybe just messing with me, but it was real. I filed a report with the local sheriff's office once I got home. I didn't expect them to find anything, and I doubt they even went up there. I never heard back. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I still take trips now and then, but never alone and never without cell service. I got rid of the axe too. I don't like the way it made me feel, sitting there with it in the dark, listening for someone who never came inside. What scares me most isn't what happened, though. It's what didn't. It's that whoever was out there never tried to break in, never spoke, never showed themselves fully. They didn't have to. They just let me know they were there. That was enough. That's what still keeps me up sometimes. Thinking about those woods, that shed, those footsteps, is how easily someone can become a part of your weekend without ever needing to say a word. I was 32 the summer I decided to take a week off from work and stay in a cabin outside Missoula, Montana. It was 2022, and I was burnt out from a string of back-to-back projects and needed to be somewhere without phone service or noise. I found a listing on a website that offered quiet, secluded places. The description said it was an off-grid cabin, 3 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by forest. The photos showed a basic wooden structure, small porch, propane stove, wood-burning heater, a table and a bed. No Wi-Fi, no plumbing. It was exactly what I wanted. I drove up in a rented Jeep on a Sunday morning. The directions were printed since I wasn't expecting signal once I got close. After turning off the highway, I followed a gravel road for nearly 20 minutes, then onto a rougher trail that twisted through pine trees and climbed in elevation. I had to go slow because of the deep ruts and rocks. It was past noon when I finally saw the cabin through the trees, sitting in a small clearing about 50 yards wide. The roof was steep and covered in dark metal sheets. A thin chimney stuck out of the top. There was a stack of wood against the sidewall and a blue barrel by the porch for collecting rainwater. It was quiet, the kind of silence that lets you hear your own breathing. The air smelled like pine and warm dirt. There were flies buzzing around the trees, but it wasn't too bad. I got out and stretched, then opened up the cabin. It was unlocked, just like the owner had said it would be. The inside was smaller than it looked in pictures, but clean. A small bed against one wall, a table and chair in the center, a stove in the corner, and some basic shelves with canned goods and matches. A cooler sat beside the door. No free. No lights except for a couple of battery-powered lanterns. I unpacked slowly, letting myself settle in. I brought enough food to last a week, mostly dry stuff and some fresh vegetables. There was a small outhouse maybe 50 feet into the trees, downhill from the cabin. The path to it was overgrown but still visible. That first night, I stayed up late on the porch, watching the sky turn dark. I had a fire going in the small fire pit a few steps from the cabin. I remember how quiet it was. I could hear the tiniest sounds, the wind shifting through leaves, a squirrel running across the roof, branches creaking somewhere out of sight. I fell asleep with the window cracked, the cool night air slowly drifting in. The first few days were peaceful. I went on short hikes during the day, following animal trails through the forest. I found an old logging road that led to a dry creek bed. I took photos of mushrooms, twisted roots, and the light breaking through the trees. I read in the afternoons and wrote in my notebook at night. By the third day, I stopped checking the time. My mind finally slowed down. It was on the fourth morning that I noticed something small and strange. When I went out to the rain barrel to wash my hands, I saw fresh scuff marks in the dirt around the porch. At first, I thought it was from me, but the shape looked different. The prints were longer and narrower than my boots, and there were two of them. They went toward the trees near the outhouse and disappeared into the undergrowth. I didn't think too much about it. Maybe it was a hunter or a local who wandered too close. That afternoon, I hiked west, trying to reach a rocky outcrop I had seen from the clearing. It took longer than expected, and I ended up turning back earlier than I wanted. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the trees. I was tired and didn't notice anything off at first. I cooked, wrote a bit, and went to sleep with the window still open a crack. The next morning, when I opened the door to get some water, I saw more prints in the dirt. A single line of them from the edge of the woods to the porch, then circling around the cabin. They were definitely not mine. They were spaced farther apart than a normal walk. No tire tracks, just those same long, narrow boot marks. I felt a chill in my chest, but I told myself again that it could be someone from town or another hiker who got curious. It was public land, after all. That night, I couldn't sleep as easily. I kept listening for footsteps or branches snapping. I had the lantern beside the bed, just in case. Around midnight, I finally dozed off. I woke up later to the sound of something tapping on the wall. Not loud, just a slow, steady tap. I froze. My heart started pounding immediately. I sat up and waited. The sound stopped. Then it started again, this time on the opposite side of the cabin, like someone was moving around. I didn't turn on the light. I just stayed still and listened. I couldn't see anything from the window. After a few minutes, the tapping stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my ears tuned to every creak and sound in the woods. When morning came, I checked outside. More prints. This time, they went right up to the window. Whoever it was had stood there for a while. I saw the spot where the leaves were flattened near the glass. My stomach turned. I kept scanning the trees, but there was nothing. I considered leaving early, but something in me didn't want to panic. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was a kid messing around. Still, I decided to stay inside more that day and kept the hatchet beside me. That night, I barred the door using a piece of firewood wedged under the handle. I shut the windows completely. I didn't light the fire. I wanted it to look like I wasn't there. I laid in the dark, holding the hatchet, watching the window. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps outside, slow and careful. They came from the direction of the outhouse, stopped for a long time, then circled to the back. I didn't move. I held my breath. Something brushed against the wall again, lightly. Then I heard the faint sound of metal, a tool maybe scraping wood. The noise stopped after maybe 10 minutes. I stayed still for another hour before falling asleep from exhaustion. When the sun came up, I got up and checked the cabin again. The back corner had a fresh scrape in the wood near the bottom, deep, as if something sharp had been dragged across it. I packed my gear in 15 minutes. I was done. I didn't see anyone on my way back to the Jeep. I kept looking over my shoulder. At one point, I thought I heard someone breathing behind a tree, but it could have been the wind. I got into the Jeep and started the engine without even checking my map. I followed the trail back to the gravel road and drove until I had cell service. When I stopped at a diner outside town, I sat there for 20 minutes before going inside. My hands were still shaking a little. I didn't call the police. I didn't tell anyone except my brother when I got home. He laughed, said I'd scared myself in the woods. But I know what I heard. I know someone was out there. Someone who never said a word, never knocked, never left a note. Just walked through the forest, night after night, getting closer and closer. I didn't go back to the woods after that. I canceled another cabin trip I had booked later that year. Even now, years later, I think about that tapping, about the footprints, about how someone could live out there, just beyond the edge of silence, watching. What still bothers me most is the realization that they never tried to get in. Not really. They could have. The door was thin, the window easy to break. But they didn't. They just wanted to let me know they were there. Every night. Closer. The scariest part wasn't what they did. It was what they didn't do. The evening was closing in, and the dense forest around the cabin seemed to be swallowing the light. I had been planning this trip for months. A weekend getaway in a secluded cabin in the middle of nowhere was exactly what I needed. I was exhausted from work and city life, and this was my chance to unplug, to breathe, to reset. The thought of spending a couple of days alone in a cozy cabin surrounded by trees was something I looked forward to more than I could put into words. The cabin was nestled on a small hill, accessible only by a rough, dirt road that led deep into the woods. The kind of place you'd see in old movies about escaping from the world. The place was small but charming, built with old logs, the kind that creaked in a way that made you feel like it was alive. I loved it immediately. It was a bit chilly when I arrived, but nothing too bad. The cabin had a small porch with a rocking chair and a few flower pots hanging by the door, a couple of them looking a little worn but still full of life. The forest surrounding the cabin was dense, the trees stretching tall into the sky, and a silence that felt heavy, like the woods were keeping secrets. I unloaded my car and carried everything inside. I had packed only what I needed: clothes, some food, and a few books to read. The place felt welcoming, with the scent of pine wood and something earthy filling the air. I set my bags down, grabbed a drink, and went out to the porch to sit and relax. I wanted to enjoy the solitude, the peace, the sounds of nature. But there was something about the stillness that felt a little off, like the forest was watching me, waiting. The sun started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. The warmth of the day faded quickly, replaced by the coolness of evening. I decided to start a fire in the small stone fireplace inside, knowing the temperature would drop even more once night settled in. The cabin had a small wood stove that crackled as I placed logs inside, and I watched the flames dance for a while, mesmerized by the flickering light. It wasn't long before the wind picked up. It wasn't a loud, stormy wind, but it carried a sort of whisper, like the trees were talking to each other. It seemed to rustle in a way that I had never heard before. It felt almost deliberate, as if the forest itself was trying to communicate. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the thought didn't sit well. It was probably nothing, just the normal sounds of being surrounded by trees. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't fully ignore the unease creeping into my chest. That night, I ate a simple dinner, read for a bit, and then went to bed. The cabin was cozy, and the bed was warm and inviting. The only sound in the night was the wind outside, gently pushing against the cabin's walls. It was peaceful, too peaceful if I'm being honest. As I lay there, drifting in and out of sleep, I heard something. At first, it was just a slight rustle, like someone moving in the leaves, but then it was louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind. It was footsteps, soft, careful steps like someone walking around the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. I waited for what felt like an eternity, listening. The footsteps stopped, and everything fell silent again. I didn't move, didn't dare to breathe too loudly. I lay there, tense, my mind racing. Was someone out there? Maybe it was just a neighbor or someone passing through, though the thought seemed ridiculous. The nearest person lived miles away, and I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. I waited a little longer, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. Then I heard it again, the soft crunch of footsteps on the dirt outside the cabin. But this time, there was something else, something I couldn't explain. It felt like the steps were getting closer. My mind screamed at me to do something, but I stayed perfectly still, afraid that any movement would give me away. The footsteps circled the cabin, moving around the perimeter, as though someone was inspecting it. My breath quickened, and I finally found the courage to grab my phone from the nightstand. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it, The signal was weak, but there was enough to send a quick message to a friend. I didn't explain much, just said someone was outside the cabin and I didn't know what to do. I didn't get a reply right away, and I didn't expect one. It was late and I was alone. I sat there, listening to the footsteps that continued to move around the cabin. And then the most unsettling thing happened. The footsteps stopped, and I heard something else. A tapping. It was soft at first, then louder. It sounded like someone tapping on the window. I dared not look. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing, hoping that whoever was out there wouldn't notice that I was awake. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The tapping continued, and then came the worst sound of all, the unmistakable sound of someone trying the door. It rattled a bit, as if someone was testing whether it was locked. The door was secure, but the mere thought of someone trying to get in made my stomach drop. I waited, frozen, trying to make as little noise as possible. I couldn't call the police. There was no signal, and even if there was, it would take too long for anyone to get here. I was on my own. The night stretched on, and eventually the noises stopped. The footsteps, the tapping, the door rattling. It all ceased. I didn't know how long I lay there, but when the silence returned, it was almost worse than the noises had been. At least when there was sound, I knew something was happening, but now, it felt like something was waiting, just out of sight. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't. Every creak of the cabin, every shift in the wind, made me jump. I kept my eyes on the door, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I leave? But I didn't know what was out there, and the thought of venturing into the woods in the dark was terrifying. I stayed in the cabin, gripping my phone tightly, feeling trapped and helpless. By morning, the light was finally breaking through the trees. I couldn't remember the last time I'd been so relieved to see the sun. I carefully checked the cabin for any signs of forced entry, but everything was as it should be. The door was still locked, and there were no marks on the windows or the walls. But my gut told me something had been out there, something that wanted to get inside. I didn't stick around long after that. I packed up my things, and after a quick breakfast, I left the cabin, driving back down the dirt road as fast as I could. I didn't care about the speed bumps or the potholes. I just wanted to get away. The woods, the cabin, it all felt wrong now. As I drove, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone in my rearview mirror. But there was nothing, just trees and then, eventually, the open road. I didn't feel safe, not until I reached the nearest town, where people were around, and the feeling of being watched began to fade. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I don't need to know. Sometimes, things are better left unknown. I've learned to appreciate the quiet, but I've also learned that not all silence is peaceful. Some silences are warnings, and I'll never forget the night I learned that. I had been meaning to take a solo camping trip for a while. I'd always gone with someone, either a friend or my brother, but this time, I wanted to try it alone. I had read online that solo camping helps you reset your mind, feel more connected with nature, and test your survival skills a bit. That all sounded good to me. I worked long hours at my job in IT, and my mind was constantly crowded with problems that didn't feel like they really mattered. I needed a break. I picked a remote spot in Central Oregon that wasn't too far from where I lived in Portland. It was called Bitter Creek Forest, and it was deep enough in that you wouldn't see many people, especially during the off-season. It was early October, right before the cold really started to bite. I planned for 2 nights. I checked the weather, packed everything carefully: tent, tarp, food, cooking gear, water filter, knife, fire starter, extra batteries, bear spray. I even brought a book and a small solar charger for my phone. I made a checklist and went over it twice. The drive took about 3 hours. The last hour was a slow, winding road up through thick woods. I lost cell signal about halfway through. By the time I got to the parking area, it was around 2 in the afternoon. There was only one other car parked there. That comforted me a little. It meant someone else was probably out there, maybe not too far off. I slung my pack over my shoulders and started the hike in. The trail was well maintained, and the air was cool but not too cold. Leaves crunched under my boots, and the wind moved through the tall pine trees with a soft rushing sound. I hiked for about an hour and a half before I found a good spot. It was flat and open enough for my tent, but still surrounded by trees on 3 sides. About 30 feet away was a small creek with clear running water. I could filter drinking water from it. I checked around for animal tracks, droppings, or anything that might suggest a bad idea. Nothing looked concerning. I set up my tent, laid out the tarp, arranged my cooking area away from where I'd be sleeping, and gathered some dry wood. I even made a small ring of stones for the fire pit. I cooked some rice and beans for dinner over the small stove and watched the sky turn orange behind the trees. It was peaceful, quiet in a way I wasn't used to anymore. No cars, no people, no humming electronics. Just wind, leaves, and the sound of the creek. When it got dark, it got really dark. I had a headlamp, but even that felt weak in the thick woods. I kept the fire going a little longer, then doused it carefully and crawled into my tent. I laid there, listening to the night sounds. The crackling of branches, distant rustles, maybe animals moving through the brush. But nothing that alarmed me. I was used to this from other camping trips. The first night passed without anything weird. I woke up a few times, mostly from cold or the usual awkwardness of sleeping on the ground, but nothing strange. I got up early, made coffee, filtered water, and walked around the area a bit. I didn't see any signs of other people. No campsites nearby, no trash, no distant voices or fires the night before. I was probably alone out here. I spent most of the day walking some of the trails. I went maybe 3 or 4 miles out and looped back, just enjoying being disconnected from everything. When I returned to camp around mid-afternoon, I noticed something odd. My cooking pot had moved. I had left it near the fire pit, upside down and clean. Now it was about 5 feet away, lying on its side. At first, I figured it might have rolled, but the ground was flat. No slope, no wind. It didn't make sense, but I brushed it off. Maybe I kicked it earlier without noticing. Still, I made a mental note. I cooked a simple dinner again, cleaned up, and settled in for the second night. This time, I felt more aware. I listened more closely to the sounds outside the tent. I was more alert. There's something about being alone in the woods on the second night. The novelty wears off a bit, and your mind starts to wander into uncomfortable places. Around 1 or 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound, a snapping twig. Not just once, repeated cracks like footsteps. I froze. I was lying on my back in my sleeping bag, barely breathing. I turned off my headlamp. The sound moved, slow, like someone or something was circling. It wasn't an animal scurrying or foraging. It was steady, deliberate. Step, pause. Step, pause. I reached slowly for my bear spray and my knife. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't want to make noise. I just laid there, waiting, breathing quietly. The sound stopped for a while. Then I heard another soft crack. Closer this time, maybe 20 feet away. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I laid there, completely still, gripping the spray, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, the sky lightened. Birds started chirping. I got up stiff and tired, unzipped the tent, and looked around. Nothing. No tracks. No sign of anyone. But when I looked at my cooking area, the pot was gone. Completely gone. I searched for it, thinking maybe an animal dragged it off. I found it 15 feet away in the bushes, upside down like someone placed it there. That rattled me. I told myself it could have been a raccoon or even a bear, but bears would leave messes. They don't carefully move objects. I sat there with my coffee, thinking. I had 1 night left, but now I wasn't sure I wanted to stay. I hated the idea of backing out early, but something felt wrong. I made the decision to stay, but I took precautions. I packed everything into my backpack and left it by the tent. If I had to leave quickly, I didn't want to waste time gathering things. I kept the bear spray in my sleeping bag with me, the knife within reach. I built a small perimeter of rocks and sticks around my tent, just enough to make noise if someone or something approached. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to give away my position. I sat in the tent for a long time before lying down. I felt on edge the entire time, like something was just out of sight, waiting. Around midnight, I started hearing noises again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. I heard a thud, like something heavy being dropped. Then I heard a dragging sound. It wasn't constant. It would start, stop, start again. At one point, something hit the tent, lightly like a stick being tapped against it. I jerked upright, heart pounding, holding the spray. I stayed like that for hours. The sounds would go away for a bit, then return, as if someone was deliberately trying to keep me awake. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun finally came up, I burst out of the tent and looked around. The rocks and sticks I had placed around the tent had been moved. Some were gone. One of the sticks had been propped upright, pushed into the ground like a marker. That's when I knew this wasn't an animal. Someone was out here. Someone who knew where I was. Someone who had been watching, playing games. I didn't eat. I didn't even boil water. I packed up my tent as fast as I could, threw everything into my backpack, and started hiking out. I didn't stop to rest. I checked behind me constantly. I tried to move fast but quiet. Every sound made me jump. A branch snapped. Was it just a deer, or was I being followed? It took me nearly 2 hours to get back to the parking lot. When I saw my car, I almost cried from relief. But when I got closer, my stomach dropped. The back of my car was open, not just unlocked, open. The hatch door was up. I had locked it, I was sure. My emergency supplies were still there, jumper cables, extra water, flares. Nothing seemed stolen, but someone had definitely opened it. I checked the inside carefully. Nothing planted, nothing missing. I slammed the hatch shut, jumped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't look back. When I got back to Portland, I filed a report with the local ranger station. They didn't seem too surprised. One of the officers said that sometimes people squat out there, or loners get a little weird. They didn't offer much help. They said they'd send someone out to check the area, but I doubt they ever did. I didn't go camping again for a long time after that. And when I finally did, it was with friends in well-trafficked campgrounds with other people nearby. I still think about it. The footsteps, the missing pot, the tapping on the tent, the stick pushed into the ground like a warning. I try to tell myself it was just a crazy drifter or someone messing around, but deep down, I know they were watching me. From the moment I set up camp, someone knew I was there. They didn't take anything. They didn't attack. They didn't speak. They just made sure I knew I wasn't alone. That's what stayed with me. The idea that someone was out there, just a few feet beyond the trees, completely silent, watching me sleep, watching me eat, waiting for nightfall. I don't think I'll ever camp alone again. The sun had just set, leaving behind the last streaks of orange across the sky. I sat by the edge of the campfire, the crackling of the wood the only sound breaking the night's silence. It had been a quiet afternoon, the kind of calm I was hoping for when I decided to take this solo camping trip. There was something therapeutic about being away from everything. Away from work, away from people, and away from the usual noise of life. This was the first time in a while I could just breathe, stretch out my thoughts, and let everything fade into the background. I had set up camp near a small, remote lake. The path leading to it had been long, and the trail was almost overgrown, as if nature had been trying to reclaim it. But that made it perfect for someone like me, who was seeking solitude. I hadn't seen a single person since the trailhead, and the only sounds around me were the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. The lake, reflecting the deepening blue sky, seemed so serene. It was just me, my tent, and the crackling fire. As I poked the fire with a stick, the orange embers burst up into the night air, creating tiny sparks that scattered briefly before fading into the darkness. I tossed a few more logs on the fire, the smell of burning wood mixing with the fresh scent of pine. Everything felt right, peaceful. I wrapped myself in my jacket and leaned back against the log I had been sitting on, letting the warmth from the fire seep into my skin. There were no plans, no rush, just me and the wilderness. The wind picked up a bit, rustling the trees around me. I shivered slightly as the temperature dropped, but I wasn't worried. I had brought a heavy sleeping bag, and the fire would keep me warm enough for the night. As I stared at the flames, I found myself growing drowsy. It had been a long day of hiking, and despite the fact that I was alone in this vast stretch of forest, I didn't feel afraid. I was used to being out in the wilderness. This was my third solo camping trip, and nothing had ever gone wrong before. The worst thing I had experienced was a raccoon stealing my food. But as the minutes passed, something about the quietness of this place started to feel a little off. It was subtle at first, like a low hum in the back of my mind. There were no more animal sounds, no distant calls from birds or the occasional rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. It was as though the world around me had held its breath, waiting for something. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. The solitude was starting to get to me, that was all. I had a habit of overthinking when I was alone too long. But then, as I stared at the fire, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A twig snapped, somewhere just beyond the light of my campfire. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up straight, my eyes scanning the darkness around me. The wind had stopped completely, and everything was still. Too still. It was probably just an animal. There were plenty of small creatures in the woods, and the forest was full of life, even if I couldn't see it. Still, the snap of the twig had been too loud, too distinct. I tried to push the thought from my mind and focus on the fire, but my ears strained for any other sounds. Nothing came, just the steady, rhythmic crackling of the fire. Minutes passed. The fire continued to burn, and the woods stayed quiet. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer or a raccoon had wandered too close. I'd heard strange sounds like that before on camping trips, and they were always easily explained away. But then I heard it again, a faint rustling, followed by another sharp snap of a twig. This time it was closer, much closer. I froze, my blood running cold. My mind raced, running through possibilities. I knew there were bears in these woods, but they weren't usually this close to camp. I had hung my food in a tree, well away from the tent, just in case. Still, the idea of a bear wandering nearby made my skin crawl. The sound came again, and this time it was unmistakable. A soft shuffle, like footsteps. Someone, or something, was moving through the forest near my camp. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up as my heart pounded in my chest. Whoever or whatever was out there, I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking as I clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the dark, revealing the forest around me, but nothing stood out. The trees, the underbrush, everything seemed normal. I could hear the faint sound of my own breathing as I scanned the area. But there was no one there, no animal, no figure, just the dark, silent trees. I slowly stood up, keeping my eyes fixed on the shadows just beyond the light. My body felt tense, my muscles tight as I clutched the flashlight in one hand, a heavy stick in the other. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I wasn't taking any chances. Whatever had been out there, I wasn't going to be caught off guard. Minutes ticked by, and I stood motionless by the fire, the light of the flames flickering across the trees. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. Maybe it was just a deer. Maybe it was just the wind again, playing tricks on me. I wasn't sure. But then, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were clearer, closer. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving toward me. The sound was deliberate, too precise to be an animal. I could hear it moving through the brush, the faint rustle of leaves and the soft snap of twigs underfoot. I spun around, my flashlight casting erratic beams across the forest, but I saw nothing. There was nothing there, nothing I could point to. My heart pounded in my chest as panic began to settle in. I tried to steady my breath, telling myself it was nothing, that it was just the wind or some other natural explanation. But something deep inside me told me that wasn't the case. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing, just the eerie silence of the night. My breath came out in shallow gasps as I stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. I kept the light trained on the trees, my eyes scanning the shadows. I had no idea who or what was out there, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. The unease that had been creeping up on me all night was now a heavy weight in my stomach. It wasn't just a bear. It wasn't just an animal. This felt different. I took a slow step back toward my tent, my eyes never leaving the darkness beyond the fire. Every rustle, every shift in the wind made me jump. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was suffocating. I wasn't alone out here. That much was clear. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, a shadow moving between the trees, just beyond the range of my flashlight. My breath caught in my throat. The shadow was tall, slender, and moving with purpose. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was real. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a figure slipping between the trees. My heart hammered in my chest as I quickly ducked down behind a large boulder near the fire. I had no idea what it was, but it was too big, too deliberate to be some random animal. The silence stretched on, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It grew stronger, more oppressive. Whoever or whatever it was still out there, just out of sight, waiting. I tried to calm myself, to think. Should I leave? Should I pack up and hike back to the trailhead, where I might be able to find help? The thought of running in the dark, of stumbling through the woods, made my stomach churn. But staying wasn't an option either. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I grabbed my things, my backpack, my sleeping bag, and shoved them into the tent. I didn't bother folding anything properly. I just needed to move. But as I hurriedly packed up, the footsteps returned. Slow, deliberate, moving toward me. I froze. My body was on alert. Every muscle tensed as I waited for the next sound. My heart pounded so loud in my ears, I was sure it would give me away. The footsteps stopped. There was no sound now, just the quiet hum of the night. Then the voice came. It was faint, barely a whisper carried on the wind. "You shouldn't be here." I didn't know what to do. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew they were close, too close. I backed away from the voice, my hands shaking. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The words echoed in my head. I was alone, but I wasn't alone. I took a deep breath and sprinted. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get away. I wasn't sure how far I ran, how long I stumbled through the trees, until I finally broke into the open. My eyes blurred with tears as I gasped for breath, my body shaking from the rush of adrenaline. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead. The familiar sign of the path back to civilization was a relief, but I didn't look back. Not once. The next day, I went back to the site with a park ranger. My camp was untouched, the fire long gone cold. There were no signs of anything out of the ordinary. No footprints, no broken branches. It was the last week of September when I took time off from work and decided to go on a solo camping trip in the northern woods of Michigan. I had been stressed out for months, just working long days at the warehouse, dealing with people, traffic, noise, everything piling up on me. I didn't want to go somewhere touristy or flashy. I wanted to go somewhere quiet and isolated, where I could hear myself breathe, maybe fish a little, sit by the fire, and just reset my brain. I picked a spot I found online, a remote lake near the Upper Peninsula, barely marked on any map, surrounded by thick forest and only accessible by an old logging trail. The few reviews I found talked about how peaceful it was and how you were unlikely to see anyone else for days. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, fishing rod, a cooler, fire starter, a few knives, a small hatchet, 2 flashlights, extra batteries, and my old .22 rifle. I never really expected to use it, but I always brought it just in case I ran into a bear or something. The weather was supposed to be clear, maybe a little chilly at night, but nothing too harsh. I left early that morning, got coffee at a gas station on the way, and drove 5 hours north. The further I got, the fewer cars I saw. Eventually, I turned onto a dirt road, and after about 30 minutes of slow, bumpy driving, I reached the trailhead. The parking area was just a flat patch of dirt with enough space for maybe 2 cars. There weren't any other vehicles there. I parked, double-checked my pack, locked the truck, and started hiking. The trail was overgrown in places and barely visible in others. It wound through thick woods for about 3 miles until I reached the lake. It was just as beautiful as I'd imagined. The water was still and black, surrounded by tall pines and birch trees. No signs of people, no sound but the breeze and birds. I set up my tent near the edge of the lake, where the ground was flat and covered in pine needles. I had a good view of the water and enough distance from the trees to be safe from falling branches. After setting everything up, I gathered wood and built a fire pit with stones. I cooked some sausages over the flames and ate as the sun dipped behind the trees, turning the lake orange. That night, I slept harder than I had in months. Just the sound of leaves and crickets outside, the cold air pressing against the sides of the tent, and nothing else. The next 2 days were the same kind of peaceful. I spent my time walking around the lake, fishing, reading, and just sitting still. I didn't bring my phone except for emergencies, and I left it off most of the time. I saw deer once, drinking at the far side of the lake, and watched a bald eagle skim across the water. It was the kind of silence that makes you realize how noisy your life usually is. On the 3rd night, something felt a little off. I had gone to sleep like usual, after eating and tending the fire until it burned down to coals. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, not suddenly, just kind of slowly becoming aware that I was awake. There wasn't any sound, not even the usual rustling or insects. I thought maybe I'd just been dreaming, but I had that odd feeling you get when your instincts are trying to tell you something. I stayed still for a long time, listening. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I finally unzipped the tent quietly and stuck my head out. The moon was bright enough to see the outline of the trees, and the lake was smooth like glass. I waited, staring at the woods, trying to pick out any movement, but everything looked still. I figured it was just my imagination and went back inside, but I left my boots near the zipper in case I needed to get out quickly. It took me a while to fall back asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and immediately noticed something strange. There were small marks in the dirt near the fire pit. At first, I thought they might be animal tracks, maybe raccoons or something, but they didn't look quite right. They were shallow, narrow, and came in from the woods. They stopped about 10 feet from the tent and then went back the way they came. I crouched down and studied them for a while, trying to figure out what made them. The shape wasn't right for deer or coyotes, and they were too far apart for smaller animals. They looked almost like the indentations of shoes, but not deep enough to be from someone walking normally. I brushed it off. Maybe it was an animal I wasn't familiar with. Maybe the ground was just soft in places and made weird shapes. I kept telling myself not to let my imagination get carried away. Still, I couldn't get that feeling out of my head, that sense of being watched. That day, I went for a longer hike, trying to shake off the unease. I circled the lake, taking my time, looking for signs of other people or anything unusual. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. I didn't even see any birds, which felt strange. Normally, you'd hear at least the occasional woodpecker or squirrel. It was like everything had packed up and left. I got back to camp around 5 p.m. and rebuilt the fire. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling jumpy. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. I cooked some food and ate fast, and by the time the sun went down, I was already on edge. I made sure everything was locked up in the bear canister and pulled into the tent early. I lay there in my sleeping bag, flashlight in my hand, rifle next to me, just staring at the ceiling of the tent. Around midnight, I heard it. A single footstep outside. Just one. The kind of sound someone makes when they step on a branch and break it under their weight. Not a crash, not a bunch of movement, just one deliberate, quiet snap. I didn't move. My heart started racing, and my ears strained to pick up any follow-up noise. But there was nothing. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then I heard a faint shuffle, like something brushing against the edge of the tent, down near my feet. I didn't even breathe. My flashlight was still in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my position. My other hand was slowly moving toward the rifle. I wrapped my fingers around it and waited. Every muscle in my body was locked. Another few minutes passed. Then silence again. I stayed like that for at least an hour, barely blinking. I don't think I slept at all. Eventually, the sky started to lighten outside, and I felt safe enough to move. I unzipped the tent slowly and crawled out. What I saw made my stomach drop. There were boot prints all around my tent. Human boot prints. They circled the whole thing. Some passed close by the fire pit, others led toward the woods. There were at least a dozen different impressions in the pine needles and dirt, and they weren't mine. I checked. My boots were still inside the tent, dry and clean. I hadn't walked around that night. I stood there for a long time, staring at the prints. Then I walked toward the trees, trying to follow them. They led about 20 feet into the woods and then just vanished. The pine needles made it hard to track, and I couldn't tell where the person had come from or gone. But someone had definitely been there, watching me. I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't even bother folding the tent properly. Just jammed everything into my pack. I kept the rifle in my hands the whole time. When I was ready, I started hiking back down the trail, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The woods were still too quiet. No wind, no birds, nothing. About halfway back to my truck, I noticed something else. A broken tree branch hanging low over the trail, about chest height. That hadn't been there before. It looked like it had been snapped intentionally and bent across the path. I stepped over it and kept moving. Another 100 yards down, I saw a pile of small rocks stacked in the middle of the trail. That hadn't been there either. Someone was following me, or maybe they'd been ahead of me. I picked up the pace, trying not to run but moving fast. I gripped the rifle tighter, constantly scanning the trees. The last half mile felt like it took an hour. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, I almost broke into a sprint. The truck was untouched. I got in, locked the doors immediately, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I just drove. The tires skidded a little on the dirt as I pulled out, and I didn't slow down until I was back on the main road. Took me a few hours to fully calm down. I stopped at a diner about 50 miles south and sat there with a cup of coffee, trying to make sense of everything. The prints, the noise, the rearranged trail. None of it made sense unless someone had been out there, watching me, messing with me. But why? There was nothing valuable in my camp. No one had taken anything. They could have hurt me, but they didn't. They just watched. When I got home, I didn't unpack right away. I left everything in the garage and sat in the living room with the curtains closed. For days, I kept thinking about those boot prints and the sound of that single footstep outside my tent. I checked local news for anything about missing people or strange reports near that lake. But there was nothing. I didn't report it to the police. What would I even say? I haven't gone camping alone since. I still think about it sometimes. About how far away that place was, how quiet it was, how whoever was out there knew I was alone. I think that's what gets me the most. They knew I was by myself. They knew exactly where I was. I've been camping solo for years. It started when I was about 22, right after I left my job at a car dealership back home in Michigan. I'd grown sick of customer complaints, fake smiles, and the way the air always smelled like burnt coffee and rubber in that place. One night, I just packed my hiking gear, threw my tent and some canned food into the back of my car, and drove west. I never really stopped doing that. By the time I turned 34, I'd been to dozens of national parks and forests. I always liked going where most people didn't. I didn't need Wi-Fi, cell reception, or company. What I wanted was trees, sky, dirt, and silence. This trip was supposed to be just like the others. Peaceful, quiet, no drama. I'd picked the Idaho Panhandle National Forests this time. I'd been there twice before, but not deep into the more isolated northern stretch past Bonner's Ferry. That was unfamiliar ground. I'd found an old trail on a blog by some backpacker from 2015. He said it was barely used, maybe 12 miles long, with an old Forest Service road you could reach with a 4WD. No recent info on it. That was part of the appeal. I left early on a Thursday morning in mid-September, hoping to avoid hunters. It had just started getting chilly at night, but not freezing yet. Perfect camping weather. I parked my truck in a gravel pull-off off the old Forest Road 287, about 2 hours off the main highway. There wasn't a single other vehicle in sight. I locked up, threw my pack on, and started hiking. The trail was barely visible. It looked more like animal paths had crisscrossed it than anything people made. I had my Garmin GPS and a laminated map I'd printed out. I also carried a SIG P365 pistol on my right hip, more for animals than anything else. I wasn't paranoid, just cautious. By mid-afternoon, I was deep in the woods. Tall pines surrounded me, and the forest floor was soft with years of dead needles. There was a thick quietness. No planes overhead, no wind, just birds now and then. I set up camp on a flat area near a ridge that dropped down into a gully. I found a nice flat patch for my tent and cooked some beef stew from a can on my small stove. That night, I sat against a log, sipping coffee from my thermos, staring at the stars. I remember thinking how lucky I was to be away from everything. No noise, no emails, no people. I went to bed around 10, but I didn't sleep well. It wasn't anything loud that woke me. It was this odd, rhythmic crunching noise. Not close, maybe 50 or 60 feet out. I figured it was a deer, maybe an elk. I wasn't worried. I kept my pistol within reach and tried to drift off again. It happened again about an hour later. Same kind of noise. Leaves, pine needles, steady steps, but never close enough for me to see anything. The next morning, I found nothing near the camp. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing that told me anything had been around. I shrugged it off. It's easy to get paranoid out there alone. Your ears play tricks on you. I hiked another 5 miles that day, deeper into the woods. The trail faded even more. I had to stop often and realign with my GPS. Around 4 p.m., I came across an old fire ring made of stones, probably from years ago. There were rusted cantabs and some charred bits of metal nearby. I decided to camp there for the night. That second night was colder. I wore my base layers and pulled my hat down over my ears. I got the same uneasy feeling around 2 a.m. That time, it wasn't footsteps, but this faint clicking sound, like 2 rocks tapping together. Slow, then faster, then nothing. In the morning, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. There were prints, boot prints, about 50 feet downhill from my tent. Faint but clear enough to tell they weren't mine. They pointed in the direction of my camp. And then away, just one set. My skin prickled. I hadn't seen a soul for 2 days. I looked around for a while, called out once, even though I told myself I wouldn't talk on these trips. No response. I thought maybe someone else had come through. A hunter maybe, but the prints were off the main trail. Why would anyone be that far out and not make any noise? I sat with that thought for a long time before deciding to keep going forward. Maybe I was being watched, or maybe it was just a leftover track from some other backpacker. But something felt wrong. I started checking behind me every 20 minutes, listening, stopping to look for movement. I'd never done that before. By the 3rd day, I was barely eating. My stomach was always tight, like it was expecting a punch. Around noon that day, I crossed a narrow stream and came to a steep slope. The trees were thinner here, and you could see down into the valley. That's when I noticed movement, just a flash of something dark between the trees across the ravine. Could have been a bear, or maybe just a trick of the light. But then I saw it again. A figure, upright, still, not moving like an animal, just standing. I ducked behind a fallen tree and watched. Whoever it was stood there for a solid minute before vanishing behind a tree. I waited another 10 minutes before moving again, heart thudding the whole time. That night, I didn't light a fire. I set up my tent in a thicker cluster of trees and covered the reflective parts with dirt and leaves. I barely slept. Every sound outside made my eyes snap open. At one point, I swear I heard breathing, not mine, outside the tent. Shallow, careful, like someone trying not to make noise. I held my breath for what felt like hours, my hand on my pistol. In the morning, I packed up and started heading back. I didn't care about finishing the loop anymore. My only goal was to get out. Around midday, I reached a stretch where the trail forked off slightly and looped around a ridge. It was slower going, but I took it, hoping to avoid whatever, or whoever, I'd seen earlier. I made good time until I found something that chilled me worse than the cold air ever could. Piece of paper, stuck to a tree with a small twig, white with a single word written in pencil. The handwriting was uneven, scratched, like someone wrote it fast. My legs locked up. I scanned the forest. Nothing moved, no sound, just me and the note. I ripped it down and kept moving. By late afternoon, the trail was starting to look familiar. I was maybe 3 miles from my truck. I kept my pace fast, almost jogging with my heavy pack. Every so often, I'd hear crunching behind me, faint, then gone. I never saw anyone. The sun started dipping low. The temperature dropped fast. I finally saw the bend in the trail where I'd first come in. Relief washed over me like a wave. I just had to reach the truck. But when I got there, the relief vanished. My truck was still there, but something was wrong. The driver's side door was open. I never leave it like that. My chest went tight. I approached slowly, pistol drawn. The inside of the truck was trashed. Glove box open. Gear strewn across the seats. The lockbox where I kept a backup phone and emergency cash had been smashed. Everything inside was gone. The worst part? Whoever did it left something behind. Piece of rope, cut clean, frayed on one end, sitting on the driver's seat like it had been placed there on purpose. I didn't wait. I threw my pack in the back, jumped in, and peeled out of there. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station an hour away. I told the clerk what happened. He just nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, that deep out. You get weirdos sometimes." I called the sheriff. They took a report, told me they'd check it out. I never heard anything back. I didn't sleep for 3 days after that. I kept thinking about the rope, the footsteps, the figure, the note. I still camp, but never alone. Not anymore. I stick to trails I know, and I always tell someone where I'm going. The woods used to feel like freedom. Now they feel like something else, something that watches back. I was 34 years old when I decided to hike and camp solo for the first time. I had done a fair amount of hiking with friends over the years, mostly on marked trails around Vermont and New Hampshire. But solo camping, that was new for me. I'd recently moved to western Wyoming, and one weekend in late September 2022, I finally decided to stop thinking about it and just go. I'd been looking at Jackson Lake on a map for a while, especially the area north of it, where the hills start to roll into more isolated ridges. I found a less traveled trail that led along the west side of the lake, with several forks that climbed into a remote patch of forest behind a ridge called Fall Creek Butte. Not a lot of people went up there. No campsites, no facilities. That was the draw. The plan was simple. Hike in on Friday morning, set up camp somewhere behind the ridge, stay one night, and hike out Saturday afternoon. I didn't tell too many people, just sent my brother a text with a pin of the general area. I figured cell reception would be weak, so I also wrote down the trail name and left it on the kitchen counter at home. I packed conservatively but thoroughly: tent, sleeping bag, bear spray, food for 2 days, a Jetboil stove, first aid kit, water filter, and extra socks. The forecast was dry and cool. I left just after sunrise Friday and parked at a small gravel turnout by the trailhead. Only one other car was there. The first few hours of hiking went smoothly. The trail was marked but rugged. I saw moose tracks along the edges and heard distant elk bugling, which was pretty surreal. The leaves had just started turning. The higher I climbed, the more orange and red filled the trees. By mid-afternoon, I reached the ridge I had seen on the map, Fall Creek Butte. It wasn't much of a summit, more like a long, uneven hump of rock and soil about 7,500 feet up. Once I was over it, I found a small hollow near a stream to pitch my tent. The water was flowing slow but steady, and the ground was soft but dry. The area felt isolated. No human sounds, no traffic noise, no airplanes, just trees and wind. I set up my tent in a small clearing about 30 yards from the stream. I made sure to hang my food high in a tree, away from the tent. Then I cooked some dehydrated chili and ate while sitting on a rock. The sun dipped behind the trees early. By 7 p.m., it was getting cold. That night was quiet, but I didn't sleep well. Every little sound outside the tent made my body tense. It wasn't fear exactly, just high alert. I heard something rustling near the stream at one point, maybe a deer or raccoon. At one point around 2 a.m., I sat up in my sleeping bag and just listened. Total darkness. Even the moon was low and blocked by trees. Morning brought some relief. I unzipped the tent and felt the cold air rush in. My breath fogged out in front of me. I made some instant coffee and ate a protein bar, then walked a little upstream to refill water. My plan was to explore a nearby rise I'd seen the day before. Looked like a small bluff just west of my camp. I left most of my gear behind and took a small day pack with water, my map, a snack, and my phone, even though it had no signal. I also carried the bear spray on my hip. The slope up to the bluff was steeper than I expected, and the ground was loose with pine needles and broken twigs. I kept climbing, pulling myself up by tree trunks and roots. When I reached the top, the view was worth it. Through breaks in the trees, I could see Jackson Lake glinting in the distance, and the Tetons far beyond it. I sat for a while, drank some water, and listened. Then I noticed something strange. It was quiet, too quiet. Even for the backcountry, the silence felt unnatural. No birds, no insects, just the wind. That's when I felt something shift in my gut. A pressure like being watched. I told myself I was just being paranoid and started heading back. I took a slightly different path down, thinking it would circle back to the stream. But within 20 minutes, I realized I was off. The slope kept pulling me down farther than I expected, and I wasn't seeing any of the landmarks I recognized. I doubled back but must have angled wrong. My map didn't help much, too zoomed out. I didn't have GPS. I hiked for what felt like an hour trying to reorient, scanning for anything familiar. I finally found the stream again, or so I thought, but something about it felt wrong. It was wider and the bank was more eroded. I followed it anyway, thinking maybe it would eventually lead me to camp. That's when I found the dead elk. It was lying on its side in the shallows, legs twisted unnaturally. The eyes were gone. Its hide had been torn open at the abdomen, ribs exposed. Flies buzzed thick in the air. The thing was fresh, no more than a day old. But what struck me was how clean the wounds were. No drag marks, no scattered fur. It wasn't a bear kill, at least not like the ones I'd seen before. This thing had been opened with precision. I stood there staring for too long. Then I started moving faster. The stream curved and twisted through thicker woods, and the sun had shifted high overhead. I still hadn't found camp. I started shouting, not for help, but just out of frustration. I felt the anxiety bubbling up. I hadn't seen another person in almost 24 hours. I hadn't eaten since morning. Eventually, I made a dumb decision. I dropped my pack to move faster. I kept only my bear spray and phone. I figured I'd come back for it when I found my bearings. That was my second mistake. The first was leaving camp without marking it. The woods began to feel tighter, thicker, like the trees had grown closer together the deeper I went. I wasn't just lost. I was disoriented. I found a rock face I hadn't seen before and realized I had no idea which direction I was heading anymore. The sun was slipping west. Shadows lengthened. That's when I heard it, crackling, not far behind me. A steady crunch of brush. Something was moving. Heavy steps. I froze, bear spray in hand. The steps stopped. I turned slowly and scanned the trees. Nothing, just trees and shadow. I moved again, more quickly now. Over the next half hour, I heard it again. A few times, always behind me. I'd stop and it would stop. I'd move and it would start again, always keeping its distance. Whatever it wasn't running. It wasn't crashing through the woods. It was following. By this point, the light was going fast. I hadn't found my pack. I hadn't found camp. I was cold, hungry, and panicking. I finally decided to make a temporary shelter. Found a shallow depression beneath some fallen branches. Cleared it out, built a wall of sticks and dry leaves. No fire. I didn't have anything to start one. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep, just sat there, gripping the bear spray, knees tucked to my chest. The temperature dropped into the 30s. Every hour I'd hear movement, soft, careful, staying just far enough that I couldn't see it. I made it to morning, barely. I stood up, stretched my aching legs, and started walking again. My goal was just to find any sign of trail. Anything. I climbed higher ground and spotted a break in the trees. Looked like a rocky outcrop. When I reached it, I could finally see the lake. Far off, but visible. I angled toward it, moving faster now. Took me another 6 hours of hiking, backtracking, and second-guessing before I hit a trail. A real one. Packed earth. Footprints. I nearly cried when I saw it. I followed it south. By late afternoon, I reached the turnout where my car was still parked. The other car was gone. When I got home that night, I ate until I felt sick and slept for almost 12 hours. I never went back to that ridge. But a few weeks later, I looked up the area on some old hunting forums and backcountry blogs. I wasn't the first to report strange kills near that ridge. Several posts mentioned cleaned carcasses. No drag marks. Sometimes deer, sometimes elk. All in the same hollow near Fall Creek Butte. One post from 2016 stuck with me. A hunter claimed he'd seen a man in full camo watching him from the trees. Silent, just standing. He thought it was a ranger until he realized the man wasn't carrying a rifle, just a long blade. The forest is big, bigger than we think. And not all the dangers in it have claws. Some of them wear boots. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. My friends and I had planned a trip to a remote cabin tucked away in the woods for a weekend of peace, relaxation, and a bit of hiking. The idea of being away from the hustle and bustle of daily life felt like the perfect way to recharge. It was early fall. The leaves had started to turn golden, and the air had a crisp bite to it that made it feel like everything was fresh and new. The cabin was located somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, in a part of West Virginia where cell service was non-existent, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. The sort of place where the only sounds you'd hear at night were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. I had rented the place online after seeing a couple of photos, nothing fancy, but exactly what we were looking for. A simple, secluded cabin with a fireplace, a porch with a view, and a couple of old wooden rocking chairs on it. A place to get away from everything. The website mentioned how the cabin had been built in the 1960s, and from the photos, it looked like it hadn't changed much since then. I liked that. It was part of its charm. I packed my bags the night before the trip, feeling excited but also a little uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on why I felt that way, but I chalked it up to the nerves I always get before heading into unfamiliar places. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't dread, just a sense of something unknown lurking just under the surface. The drive there was long, about 4 hours from the city, and the road narrowed the further we went. We passed small towns, then dirt roads, and eventually found ourselves on a gravel path that twisted through dense woods. My friend, Ben, who had driven most of the way, was starting to get a little irritated. He'd had a rough week at work, and I could tell the winding roads were testing his patience. The sun was setting by the time we finally reached the cabin, and the darkening sky made the place look even more isolated. There were no other houses in sight. I wasn't sure if I liked that or not, but it was too late to turn back now. I was eager to get inside, unpack, and start the weekend. We parked the car in front of the cabin and unloaded our things. The cabin looked exactly as I had remembered from the pictures. A 2-story wooden structure with a steep roof, a chimney, and large windows that let in a lot of light. The porch was covered with a thick layer of dust, but it still had its charm. The kind of charm you'd expect from a place that had seen many seasons, but had remained mostly untouched by time. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine wood and a slight musky scent that I couldn't place. The living room was modest, with a stone fireplace, an old wooden coffee table, and a couple of worn-out sofas. There was a small kitchen to the left, and a staircase leading up to the bedrooms on the second floor. The wood beams in the ceiling were dark, and the floor creaked under our footsteps. It felt like a place frozen in time. And in some strange way, I liked that. We set up for the night, lit a fire in the fireplace, and unpacked our food and drinks. Ben opened a few beers, and we all sat around the fire, talking about random stuff. It felt good to be away from everything, to just relax and enjoy the company. The weather outside had turned cooler, and the wind started to pick up, making the trees outside sway and groan. That's when I started feeling it. The quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind of silence that feels a bit too heavy. It wasn't like the world had stopped, but more like something was missing. I shook it off, though. I was just being paranoid, I thought. The others were all having a good time, and I didn't want to be the one to ruin the mood. As the night wore on, we decided to head to bed. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs, and we each took one. I ended up in the larger room at the front of the cabin, with a big window that faced the woods. The curtains were heavy, and I pulled them shut before lying down. The bed was comfortable enough, but the creaking of the old wooden frame kept me tossing and turning. I found myself staring out the window in the dark, the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. Around midnight, I finally managed to drift off to sleep, but the peace didn't last long. I woke up to the sound of a loud thud. It was the kind of sound that made you sit up straight in bed, heart pounding. I froze, listening. The house was silent again. I couldn't figure out what it was. Maybe an animal outside, or a branch hitting the roof. I tried to go back to sleep, but something was nagging at me. I kept hearing small noises, the kind you might ignore in a normal house, but in a place this isolated, they felt amplified. A few hours passed, and I finally fell back into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The cabin was still cold, but the sun was starting to rise, casting a pale orange light over everything. I rubbed my eyes and sat up in bed, feeling groggy. I decided to head downstairs to make some coffee. Ben was already in the kitchen making breakfast. He looked tired, his face pale. "Did you hear anything last night?" he asked, without looking up from the stove. I didn't know how to respond. I hadn't told anyone about the noises, but hearing him bring it up made me feel a little less crazy. "Yeah, actually, a few weird sounds, like something bumping against the house." Ben nodded. "Same here. I thought it was an animal, but I don't know. It didn't sound like that." We shrugged it off, though. It was probably just the house settling or an animal in the woods. Nothing to get worked up over. The day passed uneventfully. We went for a hike up the nearby trail, passing through dense forest, and even stumbled upon a small stream where we stopped for a bit. It was a beautiful spot, quiet and serene. We talked about everything and nothing, enjoying the simplicity of being away from the city. That night, we made a big dinner, grilled steaks and vegetables over the fire. The night sky was clear, and we spent a few hours sitting outside, watching the stars. But again, as the night wore on, I started to feel uneasy. It was like something was watching us, though I couldn't explain why I felt that way. We all went to bed early that night, and I tried to sleep as quickly as I could. But it wasn't long before the noises started again. First, a small knock, then another thud, followed by the sound of something scraping against the wood. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The house felt too still, too quiet. I got up and went to check the windows. Nothing outside. No animals, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But I still couldn't shake the feeling. It was like I was being watched from the shadows of the trees, even though I knew that was impossible. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump, and I found myself listening to the wind howling outside, wondering if it was just the trees causing the strange sounds. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound again. This time it was louder, and it definitely came from inside the house. I grabbed my flashlight and crept down the stairs. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but I didn't care. I had to know what was happening. The house was dark and still, and I moved through it cautiously, shining the light on everything. The kitchen was empty, the living room too. That's when I heard it. A soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being moved across the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed the sound, reaching the basement door at the end of the hallway. The door was ajar, and I could see a faint light flickering from below. I didn't want to go down there. I wanted to turn around, go back upstairs, and pretend this was all in my head. But my legs moved on their own, and I descended into the darkness. What I found in the basement was enough to make me freeze in terror. There, in the far corner of the basement, was a pile of old furniture. Broken chairs, dusty boxes, and an old wooden cabinet. And next to it, there was a trapdoor in the floor, half hidden by the furniture. The dragging noise had come from this door. Someone or something had been moving it. I don't know why, but I walked closer to it. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle, my flashlight trembling in my grip. With one hard pull, the trapdoor creaked open. Underneath was a narrow, dark space, almost like a crawl space. And in the very center of it, there was something. A bundle, wrapped in a tattered sheet. I couldn't make out what it was at first, but when I shone the flashlight on it, my stomach dropped. It was a pile of old clothes, and under them there was something that looked like a bag, a human-sized bag, a bag that had been sitting there, hidden for who knows how long. I felt my body go numb, and I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet. My mind was racing, and I had to force myself to think clearly. Someone had been down there. Someone had been hiding in the basement, and they had left whatever it was down there. I ran upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't even hear my own footsteps over the blood rushing in my ears. I reached my friends' rooms, waking them up, and we decided to leave. We packed our things in a hurry, not even bothering to lock the door behind us. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin. The lights were still on, the porch empty. I didn't know what had been hidden under that trapdoor, but I knew one thing for sure. We weren't coming back. It was the summer of 2013 when I decided to take some time off work and rent a small cabin up north in Washington state. I was 32, living alone, working long hours in IT, and I was starting to burn out. I needed quiet. I needed something that didn't involve screens, code, or phone calls. A friend of mine, Justin, told me about a remote cabin he and his cousin used a few times for hunting. It wasn't listed anywhere online. He gave me a phone number. I called, spoke with a guy named Greg, seemed trustworthy enough, and 2 weeks later I was loading up my Subaru and heading up past Omak. The cabin was about 25 minutes off the main road, tucked into a patch of woods near a dried-up creek bed. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just trees, old logging roads, and silence. The place itself was small, just one story, no basement, with a kitchen, a single bedroom, and a screened-in porch facing the woods. It had electricity from a generator and a propane tank for hot water. Greg had left the key in a lockbox on the porch. It was rustic but clean, exactly what I needed. The first few days were peaceful. I brought a bunch of books, a fishing pole, and some basic groceries. I didn't plan on doing anything ambitious. I'd get up with the sun, make coffee on the old gas stove, and sit on the porch watching the woods breathe. I'd take long walks during the day, sometimes hiking the old deer trails, sometimes just wandering near the creek. There were no other cabins around for miles. At night, I'd sit by the fire pit and listen to the sounds. Crickets, wind, the occasional rustle of an animal in the underbrush. But by the fourth night, something started to feel off. It started small, things I could have easily written off. On Wednesday morning, I went to grab the aluminum pot I'd left drying outside and found it missing. I figured maybe a raccoon had dragged it off, though I didn't see any tracks. I searched around and found it about 20 feet away, behind the woodshed, sitting upright like someone had placed it there. Odd, but not alarming. Later that day, I noticed the back screen door. The one facing the woods was unlatched. I always latched it. It was an old metal hook kind of latch that you had to actually line up and slip in. I chalked it up to me being careless. Maybe I'd just forgotten. Then, that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I thought I heard something walking outside the cabin. It was about 11 p.m. I had turned off the lantern and was lying in bed, listening to the night. I wasn't sure at first, maybe an animal, maybe my imagination, but it was the kind of sound that made your chest tighten. A slow, deliberate crunching of leaves and twigs. Not running, not darting, walking. Steady, like a person. I held my breath. The sound paused, then resumed. It moved around the side of the cabin, stopped again, then nothing. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. I didn't see anything obvious. No footprints, no disturbed brush, but the woods were thick, and the ground was mostly pine needles and dead leaves. I tried to push the sound out of my mind. Maybe it had been a deer, maybe a bear, maybe I was just on edge. I drank coffee, took a walk, tried to clear my head. But that day, around noon, something happened that made it impossible to ignore anymore. I'd taken a short trail west of the cabin that led to a clearing. The area was peaceful, with wildflowers and waist-high grass. As I was heading back, I noticed something strange nailed to one of the trees near the trail. It was a tin can, like a soup can, sliced in half with what looked like pieces of mirror glued inside. It was nailed at an angle facing downward. I stopped and looked around. There were 3 more cans nailed to nearby trees in the same weird way, like makeshift reflectors or signal devices. They weren't old either. The nails were clean. The cans weren't rusted. Someone had put them there recently. I hurried back to the cabin. When I got there, I checked the screen latch. It was unlatched again. That night, I barricaded the doors. I used a wooden broomstick to jam the front door handle and pushed the kitchen table against it. For the back door, I dragged an old bench in front of it. I turned off the generator to keep things quiet and sat in the dark, listening. I stayed up until about 3 a.m., eyes wide, heart racing at every creak and groan of the old wooden walls. Around 2 a.m., I heard the crunching again. This time, I was sure of it. It started near the woodshed's slow, cautious footsteps. They circled around the cabin again. I didn't have a gun, just a long hunting knife I'd brought for utility. I grabbed it and stood silently by the front window, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped by the back door. Then, after maybe a full minute of silence, I heard the faintest sound. The screen latch. Click. It was being opened gently. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, a second sound. The actual door handle wiggling, slowly, like someone was testing it. They tried it 3 times, then stopped. The footsteps moved away, slowly, into the woods. I didn't sleep at all. At first light, I packed my things, threw them in the car, and decided to cut my trip short. I was done. I didn't care about the refund or the rest of the week. I was out. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. Battery was dead. I opened the hood, checked the cables. Everything looked normal. I had jumper cables, but no second car, no phone, no way to reach anyone. I tried again. Nothing. Not even a click. The nearest town was nearly 15 miles away. I had no choice. I loaded my backpack with some food and water, strapped the knife to my belt, and started walking. About a mile in, I spotted something through the trees, something man-made. It was another cabin, smaller than the one I was staying in, more like a shack. I approached carefully. It looked abandoned. The windows were boarded up, the roof sagging in places. But there was a path recently used that led around the back. Behind the cabin was a small clearing, and in it I found something that made my stomach twist. Pile of shoes, dozens of them. Men's, women's, kids, all dirty, some torn, all tossed together like trash. Next to the pile was a rusted shopping cart filled with clothing, jackets, pants, shirts, all worn, some blood-stained. That's when I noticed the trapdoor. It was built into the base of a tree about 10 feet from the shack. It had a padlock on it, but the wood around the latch was cracked, recently pried open. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't walk away. I grabbed a thick branch from the ground, wedged it under the edge of the door, and pried it open. Inside was a crawl space, dirt floor, low ceiling, and the smell, rot, mildew, something worse. There were crates inside, old milk crates stacked. In one of them I saw a stack of IDs, licenses, military cards, school IDs, all different names, all different people. Some from Washington, some from Oregon, a few from as far as Texas and Utah. Another crate had phones, broken, Smashed screens, dead batteries. I felt sick. My hands were shaking. Then I heard movement, not from the woods below me, inside the crawl space. I dropped the stick and ran. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned, until I couldn't hear anything but the blood pounding in my ears. I found the logging road about 2 hours later. A forest ranger driving a utility truck saw me and stopped. I told him everything, every detail. He called it in, took me back to the station. I gave a full report. The ranger drove out with 2 deputies that evening. They found the shack, the crawl space, the crates. They also found something I hadn't seen. A series of trail cameras set up between the shack and my cabin. Someone had been watching me. For days, they never found the person who owned the shack. But they linked some of the IDs to missing persons cases going back 10 years. Hikers, campers, people passing through, all vanished near that area. I still think about it sometimes. How close I came, how random it all was. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just looking for peace, for quiet. But there are people out there who wait for folks like that. People who know the woods better than anyone. People who watch and wait and plan. I sold my camping gear. I haven't been back to the woods since, and I never will.